Some of you asked how I applied the depth map to this model, and I just want to point out that we do have a tutorial showing this whole process, but I'll go through it quickly anyway. So first I grabbed a stock model, and I brought in a frame that I was planning to lock down the graphics on, and I aligned the stock model just loosely enough to this where I knew that I could make it match in After Effects. So then I rendered the depth pass, and brought that into After Effects. Then on the frame where I was going to apply it, I took lockdown and pressed lockdown. Inside this stabilized pre-comp, I deleted the checkerboard. And just to make life a little easier, I use the regular default render because at this point I have to line this up to make it match with the footage. So I placed some pins using the puppet pin tool. And then just turn down the opacity a bit. And loosely nudge this into place. And if you take a look, that's probably close enough. So this isn't the depth map, this is the actual render. This is just much easier to align at 50% opacity because you can see some of the contours and edges. So you can pre-compose this, leaving all attributes in the comp. And then inside here, you can actually place the depth map. And there, now that's actually aligned. I'm not really going to bother with the neck. So moving back into the main comp, we can just play this. So one thing I do right away is knowing that these edges might want to be expanded just a little bit. Let's just put a small matte joker on here. And then I'm going to blur this a bit. This depth pass doesn't really have to be that accurate. It's just going to give you a general shape. It's not an actual 3D solve. So I'll say maybe 10 pixels and repeat edge pixels. And then just for safety purposes, we probably want to expand this. So I'm just going to duplicate this layer and I'll make the blur even more, maybe 30 pixels. And then I'll go to color correction, curves, alpha, and just bring that up so you have a pretty healthy border. So let's get all of this into Cinema 4D. First, you're probably only going to need the first frame of the depth pass actually. I feel like putting in the whole sequence probably isn't necessary. So let's just render out a single frame here. You want to render out the whole background. And of course you'll need the actual alembic. So with lockdown, do a field of view estimate. In this case, I just guessed the camera must be around 15 degrees horizontal field of view. So you punch that into this camera field and then press export to alembic. And now let's bring these into Cinema 4D. I'd get started with the alembic first. So I'll drag that in. Just make sure your frame rate is the same or nothing is going to work and it's going to look really terrible. Seriously, just go back, double check this frame rate because you can ruin a whole project if you choose this stuff incorrectly at the start and build off of it. Set the frame length. Let's hide our background. This mesh has a little green icon next to it. That means that the vertex count isn't changing. If this is green, then all you have to do to edit this and work with this is press the Make Editable button. And let's just turn on this. And let's just turn on lines. And you can see what's happening. If this is red, check out the other tutorial, which can show you how to do the same thing using a pose morph tag. In future versions of Lockdown, we're going to make sure that the point count is consistent, and no matter how points overlap and change, that always comes in green. We just haven't quite got to it yet. Taking a closer look at this mesh, the normals are going to be messed up. So go to Options and turn on Backface Culling, and you'll notice that the normals are facing totally different directions. That's okay. Select your mesh, go to Mesh, Normals, Align. Sometimes this Align tool doesn't always get every single face, but that's okay. You can just grab any of the ones that are flipped and go to Mesh, Normals, Reverse, And then I will just select this whole object and make sure that this is facing camera and go to mesh, normals, reverse. So now everything is facing camera. I don't know what this one's doing in the middle of the mouth, but I'm not going to worry about it. And then just delete the normal tag off of your mesh here. And this will be good to go. At this point, it's probably a good idea to get your texture on here. So create a new material. I'll shut off reflectance. And under texture, make sure to set this to animated, make sure it's at the same frame rate, and drag this onto the mesh. Now this is where a lot of people are going to get confused. See how this just totally isn't tracking and looking crazy. That's because the animation is happening on the UVs. This needs to be a camera projection. So take this camera, I believe it's still part of the Alembic, so you have to make it editable, so it's just a regular old camera. And then on this tag here, can't be set to UV mapping, it has to be set to camera mapping. Drag this camera down into the camera tag, press calculate, and now you'll notice that lines up perfectly. That is projecting that texture straight from this camera. Now let's put the depth on there. So we'll go to displacer, place that on the mesh, and we'll choose that single still image for the depth. There are definitely ways where you could use the animated depth pass. However, that's going to require some more knowledge in Cinema 4D or Maya or Blender or whatever 3D package you're using. I'm just going to go with the still because honestly it looks pretty good and it's very easy to set up. Under your object settings, just set this to something ridiculous like 1,000 centimeters. For the type, you want it to be set to intensity. And direction, go to planar and set that to Z- towards camera. So you're probably noticing that as we change the distance of this depth, things are not aligning, right? So if we take this strength and we bring it down to 0, you'll notice that the nose is lined up, the mouth, the lips are lined up. And the further we push it, the further out of alignment this is getting. Notice how the side of the face isn't matching here. Well, that's because this is pushing straight forward on Z, and it needs to be pushing down the camera axis. So we have to compensate by using an FFD deformer. So let's grab this FFD, place it underneath the displacer on this mesh object. The grid size needs to be 1920. The height needs to be 1080. And we need 2 points for each of these dimensions here. The length needs to be the total length from this back plane here at 0 to the camera. So we can get that by copying that from these coordinates. And for the grid size, let's just paste that number in. Right now it's set to negative. Let's just make that positive so there's nothing unexpected there. And now this needs to be half of this number here, so I'll copy this. So that way it sits exactly between the camera and this plane here. So I'll go to coordinates, and in the Z position we will just paste it. So that's all the way back at the camera. And let's just put a divided by 2 here. Hit enter, and that is correct. Now there's something wrong with the height, so let's just cut that in half because it looks like it's the full length down. Divide that by 2 as well. And now this is perfectly aligned. So what we want is instead of this thing pushing on Z, we want these FFD points here. We'll just go into point mode and grab the 4 of these. And we'll just shrink them. And notice how that texture is coming back into alignment. So I'm going to hit undo and zoom in. And I'm going to take those and scale those down like this. But when we look, that's putting everything perfectly back into alignment. So to make sure this is completely zeroed out and predictable, you can just click down here and set this to 0 and 0. And this FFD is going to make sure that the displacer is moving towards the camera. So I'll just take my strength here and bring this down, and that'll move all the way towards the camera. And if we want to get completely ridiculous with it, I think 7,000 was the total distance. You can see that pushing right into the camera there. I'm just going to set my panels to 2 views side by side. And on this one, we will actually look through the renderable camera. And you'll notice that as crazy as this looks, it's pushing straight towards camera no matter what the actual depth is. So this is actually completely correct. So let's set this back to something more reasonable. And at this point, we're really just going to look at it and try to decide what makes this face look about normal. 2000 definitely looks like too much. Let's scroll this back. And I'll just say 1650 seems to work. And now when we play this, we have our 3D mesh. And again, we can grab the mesh here, put on a subdivision surface, and that's going to smooth that really nicely. So we'll just scrub through. You can see that's looking pretty good. I'll undo that though, we don't actually need the subdivision surface. And it's pretty easy to attach objects. We can do so using a hair system. So I'll go to Simulate, Hair Objects, Add Hair. And I won't get into the tutorial for this, but there are plenty of tutorials online that could show you how you can change this to an instance. And attach objects. Wow, that is very strange looking. But you get the general idea. That's all it takes to get this set up in 3D. With a little extra work, you can get the neck and the teeth in there using the same technique. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.